I can still taste the crisp air of that bright morning, the faint smell of fresh flowers in the chapel, the echo of organ music bouncing off the stone walls. We had our wedding in early spring. Sarah wore a simple, flowing white gown that day. I remember how the light from the stained glass windows caught in her hair and made her face look luminous and almost transparent, like something out of a dream. I heard the shuffle of our guests as she stepped onto the aisle. My heart hammered with a strange mix of joy and terror. A million thoughts tore through me. I'm really doing this. I'm never going to be alone again. She's the woman I want. I remember telling myself, hold it together. Because if I let the tears come, I wasn't sure I'd be able to stop. And yet, behind all that excitement, there was a tiny, trembling fear, an unspoken question. Will time be kind to us? I slip in and out of that memory sometimes. It feels like stepping into another man's shoes, someone more hopeful, younger, full of promise. I recall how Sarah looked at me when she reached the altar. Her eyes were shining with an emotion I recognized as absolute faith in this new life we were beginning. She once told me, "You make me feel safe." I believed her. And then the ceremony moved forward. The vows were said, the rings were exchanged, the applause thundered, cameras flashed. And for a moment, it seemed we had the entire world's blessing. But time has strange hands. It can lift you up, and then drop you, leaving you to wonder if you ever deserved that happiness in the first place. Now, when I think of our wedding, the memory tastes bittersweet, because I see it through the lens of everything that followed. Quiet nights of her turning away from me in bed, the emptiness inside her eyes when I came home from work, the phone calls she would answer in hushed tones. Sometimes it feels like I dreamed that wedding day. Or maybe that man at the altar wasn't me at all. I don't sleep well anymore. Nights stretch out like old chewing gum, sticky and stale, refusing to let go. I pace the house, noticing the tiniest details. A scuff mark on the floor that I've never seen before, a faint crack in the ceiling that almost resembles a road map. And then I look at our pictures on the wall. One shot from our honeymoon in Hawaii. She's wearing a yellow sundress, smiling wide, hugging me around the waist. My own grin is childish. We look carefree, like two fools who believe the world belongs to them. I feel something coil in my stomach when I see that photo, because I know now how naive I was, how naive we both were, or maybe just me. The moment that real doubt took hold in my mind was the night she returned from her so-called girls' trip. She announced it barely a week before going. Some new spontaneous getaway, she said, with old college friends to celebrate a milestone. I tried to act supportive. I'm a man who's always believed in giving space, in not being controlling. So I told her, sure, enjoy yourself. Inside, a small voice whispered that something felt off. But I silenced it. And then she came home. I was sitting at the kitchen table, a half-empty coffee mug in my hand. She walked in with a bright suitcase that looked heavier than when she'd left. She was wearing that same blue hoodie she often used for traveling. Her eyes flicked to me for a brief second. "Hey," she said, as though coming back from a normal day. I noticed the scent clinging to her clothes. It wasn't any perfume I recognized. It had a musk to it, a faint masculine tang that seemed to hang around her sleeves and in her hair. My first thought was, maybe she stayed in a hotel where the laundry soap had that odd fragrance. But the smell was so distinctly personal, like skin pressed against skin. And then she set the suitcase down. Even from across the room, I could smell it. His cologne. That first encounter, my mind was screaming, "This is impossible. You're imagining things." But I couldn't speak. The night passed in a haze. She gave me a quick hug, or something approximating a hug, then marched off to the bathroom to shower. When she emerged, I asked her, "How was the trip?" She shrugged and said, "Fun," with a half smile. No details, no stories about her friends, nothing. I remember forcing a laugh. That's all. She just nodded, eyes down, heading to the bedroom, leaving me with a ragged feeling in my chest, some swirl of dread I couldn't quite name yet. But I knew. That same night, I tried to kiss her, out of habit, or maybe out of desperation to confirm something. She turned her cheek. And that, ironically, was the first time I caught a whiff of that cologne on her hair. A stronger impression. It clung there, refusing to fade. I think my heart died a little in that moment. I lay awake until morning, while she slept as if nothing in the world weighed on her conscience. Time moved forward, but I felt suspended in a nightmare. She would come home from errands smiling, smelling vaguely of something that wasn't hers. Or she'd vanish for hours, returning with the same abstract story about a friend she'd met for coffee. I started taking notes in my phone. Day 1, no kiss. Day 2, no eye contact. Day 10, she left at 8 p.m., returned at 2 a.m. I felt like a detective in my own life, searching for proof I didn't really want to find. About 2 weeks later, I found that photo, tucked inside one of her travel folders in the closet. It was from the girls' trip. I saw her in a beach chair, wearing a smile that seemed genuine. In the foreground, I spotted a pair of male legs, strong, tanned, definitely not mine. My mind roared at me. She was never alone. She wasn't with her girlfriends. I recognized the brand of sneakers on his feet. An athletic type. Maybe. My stomach twisted. For a second, I remembered how she used to ask me, "Would you ever forgive me if I betrayed you?" She asked that once early in our marriage, after we watched a movie about infidelity. I said, "Why talk about that? It's pointless." She pressed, "No, I'm serious." I told her, "I don't know. I hope I never have to find out." I recall the uneasy hush that followed. Now I had that question burning in my head. Would I forgive her? Should I even try? My chest felt tight, breath harder to catch. In that moment, it's like I saw the entire facade crack wide open. I thought about confronting her, but I also felt an almost paralyzing fear, because if I forced the truth into the open, if she admitted it, what then? Where would I go from there? I'm a college lecturer by trade, ironically teaching courses about personal development and authenticity. My students look up to me because I speak with conviction. You have to be yourself, I tell them. After everything and everyone else, you're still you. Only you. There's a portion of my lecture dedicated to honesty in relationships, about the toxicity of secrets. But each time I uttered those words this past semester, it felt like a hammer slamming into my gut. I realized that I was lying to myself every moment I stepped off that lectern. I was the worst kind of hypocrite. She didn't come to my lectures anymore. She used to show up sometimes, watch me speak, smile at me from the back row. Now I looked out at the crowd of students and saw only strangers' faces. Strangely, I felt relief. I couldn't bear to see her there, to deliver grand speeches about integrity while living the opposite at home. One night, I broke. I tried to glean details. I said, "Sarah, remember you once asked me if I'd ever forgive you for betrayal." She looked at me over the rim of her mug, silent. "Why'd you ask me that?" I pushed. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "I don't recall," she murmured. I repeated the question. She set her mug down, tension gathering around her mouth. "It was years ago. It's not important." I asked again, "Would you forgive me if I betrayed you?" She flinched like she'd been slapped. Then she responded, "I never thought about it," in a cold, dismissive tone. That was her entire answer. Silence followed, heavy as concrete. Eventually, a night came when she slipped out, thinking I was asleep. I dozed off on the couch, but my eyes snapped open when I heard the faint click of the front door. So I waited. Hours passed. She returned close to dawn, creeping inside like a thief, and something inside me just flipped. I stood up from the couch, stared at her, and she gasped. The raw shock in her expression told me everything. She hadn't expected me to be there, waiting. I said nothing. She froze, both hands clutching her purse strap, eyes wide. Then she stuttered. I needed air. I stared at her. My mouth felt parched. If I opened it, I was afraid I'd scream or choke, so I just turned and walked to the bedroom. I think that was the final straw. From that moment, I realized we couldn't keep pretending. And yet, I still clung to some last shred of denial, because truly accepting her betrayal meant stepping into a world where my entire life would collapse. Our home turned into a silent battlefield. I found 1,000 ways to avoid the confrontation, burying myself in work, in grading papers, in reading. I spent more time in the library than necessary. She often didn't come home until late. We drifted, unmoored, like two strangers who merely shared a roof. But the tension kept building, like a storm cloud ready to burst. My nightmares changed from vague shadows to a recurring dream. I'd see her and some faceless man entangled, the smell of sweat and cologne suffocating me, and I'd hear her laughter as if from a distance. Then I'd jolt awake, heart pounding, my t-shirt drenched in cold sweat. The day I discovered his name was the day I picked up her phone by accident. I was fumbling for my own device on the counter. Hers lit up in my hand. A message flashed on the screen. "Miss you." M. My blood froze. I stared at that single letter, M. I didn't open it. I set her phone down like it was covered in acid. My mind reeled. M could be a friend, sure. But deep down, I knew. Later, I overheard her talking to a girlfriend on a call she didn't know I was listening to. She mentioned Michael. The tone in her voice made my stomach twist. It was the tone of someone recounting a secret that made her breath catch. After she hung up, I typed that name into a search engine out of sheer desperation, scanning faces of local men named Michael. Then I found him. Michael Parker, co-owner of a local gym. I recognized him from a LinkedIn photo. Tall, athletic, perfect teeth. And I closed the laptop before I threw up. Days blurred. I poured my energy into my lectures, ironically telling my students about living with purpose, about the importance of facing your fears. But I felt numb. My nights were consumed by obsession. I pictured them together. How would she look at him? Did she laugh at his jokes the way she used to laugh at mine? Did she hold his hand in public? Did she say his name in the dark, the way she once said mine? And the constant, relentless question, why am I still here? A week after I learned his name, I confronted her. I came home to find her texting. She quickly locked her phone, set it aside, gave me a stiff smile. My heart pounded, my breath came shallow. I approached her. "Let me ask you something," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. She rose from the couch, arms folded. "What?" I asked. "What is Michael Parker to you?" She froze. Her lips parted slightly. She blinked, once, twice. Then her cheeks paled. "He's a friend," she began, but the words died in her throat. I stared, waiting. She lowered her gaze. There was a second of raw, trembling silence. Then she whispered, "It's complicated." I felt an immense cold spread through me. "Remember you always asked me if I'd forgive you?" I asked her. "Remember how you said you'd hate me if I kept secrets?" She opened her mouth, but no words came. "I'm asking the same questions now." I paused, meeting her eyes. She looked away. "Would you hate me if I kept secrets?" She tried to step closer, but I put up a hand. "No, don't." My voice sounded dead in my own ears. Her eyes brimmed with something like guilt, maybe regret. But it wasn't enough. Not for me. I turned and walked to the bedroom, leaving her there in the silent living room. I felt my entire world fracturing. The weight of her betrayal pressed down on my chest. Yet I also felt a disturbing clarity. This was real, and there was no going back. Sometimes I revisit small memories. The day we drove home from the hospital after her mother had surgery, and how she cried in the car, gripping my hand like it was a lifeline. Or the time she surprised me on my birthday with a candle at dinner, wearing that black dress that made her eyes look huge and sparkling. Those glimpses of the past swirl in my mind, overshadowed by the new images, the fresh sense of contamination. I keep wondering, where did we lose each other? A few days later, I came home earlier than usual. I found the house empty. Curiosity, anger, suspicion, call it what you will, pushed me to open the closet door, rummage through her things. I discovered 2 sets of plane tickets. One was for that girl's trip. Another was for a weekend in Florida a few weeks later. Both times, the passenger next to her seat was listed as Michael Parker. My hands trembled holding those stubs. My mind reeled. She had planned another getaway. So this was more than a fling. This was a carefully orchestrated betrayal. That night, she came back. I confronted her again. Where were you going with him? I asked. She stiffened. It's none of your business, she snapped, then swallowed, perhaps realizing how terrible it sounded. I forced a laugh. None of my business. My voice cracked. I'm your husband, for God's sake. I saw the muscle in her jaw tighten. For a moment, I thought she might slap me or lash out with words meant to wound. Instead, she just turned away. I'm sorry, she said. I can't talk about this right now. So I poured a glass of whiskey, sat at the table, stared at her. I sipped slowly, waiting for her to speak. She never did. We slept in separate beds that night. Me on the couch, her in the bedroom. I found it ironic that after all these years, after the way we used to cling to each other for warmth, we were now physically and emotionally divided. As the days ticked by, I felt something inside me shift. I'd catch myself thinking about dying, just letting go of everything. The pain sat like a rock in my chest. I'd replay the memory of our wedding day, almost wanting to tear it out of my mind, because it hurt too much to recall. The humiliating part was, I still loved her in some twisted way, or perhaps I just loved the memory of who she used to be. But eventually, love gives way to anger, or maybe to cold resolve. She came home late one night, the air heavy with the tension of unspoken truths. I stood in the hallway, waiting. She tried to walk past me, but I blocked her path. Did you see him tonight? I asked. Her face crumpled. She nodded. No more lies. Just that tiny nod that made my world spin. I stared at her, swallowing back bile. Did you sleep with him? My voice sounded strangled. She said nothing. But her silence was the loudest answer I'd ever heard. I remember the slam of the bedroom door, her rapid footsteps, the hushed sobs she tried to muffle, and me standing there with my hands shaking, my nails digging into my palms. For a moment, the room felt like it was spinning, and I wanted to vanish, to sink into the floor. This is it, I thought. There's no going back. Days passed, each a slow descent into deeper numbness. Our conversations were mechanical. We existed in the same space, but rarely collided. I found myself fantasizing about a final confrontation, or some grand gesture that would bring closure, maybe driving to that gym where he worked, confronting him in front of his clients, maybe writing her a letter that spelled out every ounce of my hurt. But in the end, I did nothing. I just drifted in that stifling atmosphere, day in and day out, lacking the energy to decide. Then came the night I truly saw them together, in the flesh. It was accidental. Or maybe fate has a cruel sense of humor. I was finishing a late lecture at the college. I walked out to my car in the faculty parking lot, juggling a stack of papers under my arm. My car was parked near the stadium. As I approached, I glanced across the street toward a small park. 2 figures were leaning against a lamppost, locked in a passionate embrace. The woman wore a red coat. Sarah had a red coat just like that. My heart hammered. I stepped closer, squinting in the dim light. I froze. I recognized her silhouette, the curve of her neck, the tilt of her head as she kissed him. He was tall, muscular, with short, dark hair. Michael. My knees felt weak. I wanted to run or scream or tear them apart. Instead, I just stood there, pinned to the pavement by the weight of my own devastation. The entire world seemed to slow. I saw the way her hand slid up his chest, the way she leaned into him with a soft moan that drifted across the asphalt. I felt an irrational flash of jealousy that seared my chest. That used to be me. That used to be my moment, my kisses, my intimacy. Now I was just an onlooker to my own downfall. They finally broke apart. She glanced over her shoulder, as if sensing eyes on them. I ducked behind a row of cars, breathing shallowly, quietly. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure they'd hear it. I heard their low voices, some laughter. Then they crossed the street together, disappearing around the corner. I waited a full 5 minutes before I dared move, and when I finally got into my car, my hands shook so badly I could hardly fit the key into the ignition. I drove home in a daze, barely conscious of the road, tears stinging my eyes, though they never fully fell. I think my mind was too numb, too shocked to produce tears. That night, I lay awake again, silent. Sarah came home past midnight, tiptoeing in. I pretended to be asleep, but every nerve in my body was alert. I heard her undress, slip into bed, sigh. That moment felt like a perverse parody of a normal marriage. The husband feigns slumber. The wife returns from another man's arms. Something in me snapped. I realized I could not continue living like this, but I had no plan yet, no blueprint for escape or revenge. Over the next few days, my mind circled back to one notion. I needed to confront not just her, but him. I needed to see the face of the man who'd stolen my life. I found out from a local news piece that his gym was hosting a promotional event. Anyone could attend. So I went. That morning, I woke up earlier than usual. My reflection in the mirror looked aged, lines etched around my eyes, my hair thinning. I dressed in a simple shirt and jeans, no wedding ring. I'd taken it off the night I saw them kissing. At the gym, I roamed around the lobby until I spotted him near the free weights. He was talking to a potential client, his posture confident. He radiated that kind of easy charm I'd never possessed. It made me feel small, but also fueled a quiet anger inside me. I lingered behind a column, just observing. My pulse was unsteady. Then he turned, his eyes swept over me. He gave me a polite nod, just another potential customer. I felt almost nauseous. I wondered if he recognized me from a photo in our home. Probably not. Sarah never cared to have pictures of me in her phone, I guessed. For a crazy second, I contemplated walking right up, introducing myself as her husband, seeing how he'd react. But my courage failed. I left the gym and drove aimlessly around the city. That night, I waited for her again. She came home around 7, earlier than usual, which surprised me. She looked anxious, like she expected a confrontation. I walked up to her. "I went to Michael's gym today," I said. Her face went white. She set her purse down carefully. "Why?" My voice was steady. "Because I needed to see the man you've thrown everything away for." She flinched, stepping back. I continued. "He looks strong, successful. I wonder if he's worth it." She inhaled sharply, a tremor passing through her lips. I repeated the question she once asked me. "Would you stay if I betrayed you? Would you hold on, or would you run?" She just stared, tears welling in her eyes. "Don't." She tried, but I cut her off. "We both know the answer." We didn't speak again that night. She slept in the guest room, and I paced the living room until the early hours. I could almost hear the echoes of the vows we took so many years ago, mocking me, reminding me how far we'd fallen. My lectures continued. I stood at the podium, talking about self-reliance, about the power of personal narrative. But the irony was too much. I started skipping sections of my script. I'd just talk about random topics, or let the students lead the discussion, because I couldn't muster the strength to speak with conviction about integrity or faith in relationships anymore. Then one night, everything reached a boiling point. She was in the bedroom. I could hear her speaking on the phone. It was well past midnight, and she thought I was asleep. But the bedroom door was slightly ajar, and her voice, though quiet, was unmistakably tender. "I miss you too," she whispered. "Of course I do. I wish I could be there right now." My jaw clenched so hard it ached. My entire being screamed with silent rage. I walked away. I couldn't bear to hear more. It was about a week later when she told me she'd be going on a work trip. My mind reeled. Here it is again, another lie. She left on a Thursday. That same day, I packed my suitcase with the bare essentials. I sat down to write a letter. It wasn't long. It said, "I'm done. I can't pretend anymore. Don't look for me." Then I tore it up, deciding that no letter could fully express the storm inside me. Instead, I left a blank sheet of paper on the table, pinned under my old wedding ring. Let that speak for me. I drove to a motel on the outskirts of the city, somewhere anonymous. I turned off my phone, lying on the bed for hours, feeling like a ghost. A sense of emptiness devoured me. Was I free now, or just broken beyond repair? In the darkness, I realized I didn't even know if I wanted to live. Images of them kissing flashed before my eyes. My heart pounded with despair, but I felt no tears, just a hollow, gnawing ache. Eventually, I turned my phone back on. A flood of missed calls and texts arrived. From her, from a few friends, from my sister, who must have heard something was wrong. Sarah's messages started with panic. "Where are you? Please, come home." Then they turned apologetic. "I'm sorry. Let's talk. I need you." I scrolled through them blankly. She needed me now. After all this, I laughed, a sharp, joyless sound. Then I powered off the phone again and tossed it aside. I stayed in that motel for 3 days, drifting in and out of a daze, fueling myself on black coffee and stale sandwiches. I hardly recognized the man in the mirror. He looked ragged, eyes sunken, unshaven. My mind felt dull, but a new clarity rose from that dullness. I had lost everything that mattered, yet maybe that was the first step to being truly free. The quiet voice of reason told me, "You won't heal by clinging to the shards of a broken marriage." Another part of me wanted revenge. But how? On the 4th day, I checked out and drove aimlessly again. The city's lights blurred in the early evening haze. I ended up parking near that same gym. Michael's place. I just sat in the car, engine off, wrestling with the urge to do something extreme. Maybe confront him physically. The image of punching him in the face sprang to mind, or screaming at him in front of everyone. But that felt hollow. I'm not a violent man by nature. Another thought. Maybe I could stage some humiliating exposure. But that, too, seemed pointless. I realized my real revenge was simply walking away from her, removing myself from the equation, and letting her deal with the wreckage. Because the moment I left her, truly left her, she'd lose the stable ground she always had with me. Her illusions of having both me and him would shatter. So I started the car again and drove off. I got an apartment in a cheaper part of the city. 1 bedroom, minimal furniture, exactly what I could manage on my lecturer's salary. I resigned from my usual course load at the college, requesting a leave of absence for the next semester. I needed space, time to think, or maybe time to disintegrate in peace. As the weeks passed, Sarah tried reaching out multiple times. At first, I ignored her calls and messages. Then, one day I answered. She sounded frantic, tearful. "I'm sorry. I made a mistake. Let's fix this." Her words spilled over. It was never serious. I just needed excitement. She tried to explain that she felt suffocated, that I was distant or too wrapped up in my own routine. I listened in silence. Inside, I felt a kind of void. Then she said, "Please come home," in a trembling voice. I shut my eyes, remembering the vow we took, the dream I had of us building a life together. I recalled the betrayal I witnessed, the smell of his cologne on her clothes, the nights she lied so easily. In a calm tone, I answered, "You told me once you'd never forgive me if I betrayed you. So why should I forgive you?" I heard her gasp. Then I hung up. It felt final, like slamming shut a coffin lid. I drifted through the next few months, living in a numb state. I had no illusions that time would fix me. Time doesn't heal. It only erases. It wears you down until you forget what you once had, until you stop feeling the pain so acutely. Some days, I woke wanting to die. Other days, I simply existed, like a machine performing tasks. I ate, slept, stared at the ceiling. But gradually, a strange sense of freedom emerged. I wasn't chained to her anymore. I could walk out the door without explaining myself. I had no illusions left. That emptiness, in a way, gave me permission to move at my own pace. One evening, months later, I heard through a mutual friend that Sarah and Michael had split. He'd apparently moved on, leaving her flailing. The friend told me Sarah was in a bad state, that she blamed herself. I listened without much reaction. Maybe once that news would have moved me, but now I just felt the mild sting of old wounds. She'd made her bed. I had no interest in lying in it with her. I kept to myself, rarely speaking to anyone. The only real contact I had was with a few loyal students who emailed occasionally, asking if I'd return to teach. I always told them, I'm not sure, because I didn't know if I had anything left to give. Meanwhile, Sarah kept calling and texting. I let it go to voicemail. Then, one night, a message came through that caught my attention. She said in a quiet voice, I'm sorry for everything. I know I'm too late. I wish we could talk one last time, face to face. Something in her tone made me think she was genuinely broken. For a long time, I sat there, phone in hand, debating. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her in a public place, a quiet diner near the edge of town. She arrived wearing a coat I'd never seen, looking pale. We sat across from each other in a booth, the smell of coffee and frying onions heavy in the air. The fluorescent lights made her look older than I remembered. She tried to speak, but words caught in her throat. Finally, she said, I was wrong. I betrayed you, and I broke something we can never get back. I sipped my coffee, not responding. She continued, I know I can't fix this, but I just wanted you to know that you didn't deserve it. She looked down at her hands, fiddling with a napkin. I studied her face, once so familiar. I felt a pang of grief for the version of us that no longer existed. Then I asked the same questions she once asked me, coldly and methodically. Would you stay with someone who lied to you for months? Would you trust a person who hid plane tickets, who came home reeking of another body? Would you forgive a betrayal that cut the ground out from under your feet? She swallowed, tears rolling silently down her cheeks. She whispered, no. I nodded. Then we lapsed into a long silence. The diner's air conditioning hummed. After a while, I said, there's nothing more to talk about. I stood up. She reached for my hand, but I slipped away. Outside, the sky was dark, the parking lot nearly empty. I paused by my car, breathing in the cool night air. I felt the finality of it, like a door slamming shut in my soul. She stepped out behind me, tears on her cheeks, mouth quivering. I stared up at the sky, the stars hidden by city glare. I realized the only words left to say were none at all. So I opened the car door, slid in, and drove away. In the final stretch of this story, there's no triumphant victory, no grand resolution, just a quiet aftermath. I didn't move back in with her. I didn't burn her photographs in some dramatic ritual. I just let time proceed in its dull, erasing way. She sent me a divorce petition a few months later. I signed it. We both parted ways. I heard she sold the house eventually. I never bothered to go back. These days, I live alone in a small apartment in another town, a couple of hours from the city. I still get up in the morning, make coffee, stare at the steam rising from the mug. Sometimes, I recall the day we were married, the organ music echoing off the stone walls, the smile on her face that promised me forever. But it's a distant echo now. I can't say if I'm better off or worse. I'm just here, breathing, surviving. People ask me if I've forgiven her, or if I'll ever trust another person again. I tell them I'm not interested in those answers. I'm no longer a man who demands closure. I don't see the point in waiting for time to heal me. Time doesn't heal. It rubs away your memories until the pain is more like a dull bruise than an open wound. That's all. I don't blame her anymore, nor do I blame him, or even blame myself. We're all just pieces in a puzzle that didn't fit. The last time I saw her was nearly a year after our final talk. It happened by accident, in a grocery store parking lot. She was loading groceries into her car. Our eyes met from a distance. She gave a small, tentative wave. I nodded but didn't move closer. A few seconds later, I turned away and left. No words passed between us. That nod was enough. An acknowledgement of a shared past that no longer existed. Sometimes, late at night, I feel that old ache, the desire to just let go of it all. But the difference now is that I keep moving anyway. My dream of dying has faded into a shadow. It's still there, lurking, but it doesn't consume me. I think that's what people call acceptance. I've stopped expecting a cure for what happened, or some moral lesson. There's no lesson, just the knowledge that people can love you and hurt you in the same breath. I don't do big speeches about honesty in my lectures anymore. I've stripped down my curriculum to simpler points: personal resilience, coping strategies, acknowledging our flaws. My students say they find my words raw and powerful. I guess that's some small redemption, if you can call it that. They don't know the details, of course, but maybe they sense the authenticity of someone who's been dragged through the muck of heartbreak. Once, a young man asked me after class, "Do you believe in second chances?" I looked into his earnest face. I thought about it. I thought about Sarah, about Michael, about how the three of us ended up playing parts in each other's undoing. Finally, I answered, sometimes second chances just lead to second betrayals. But you've got to live with that possibility if you choose to try again. Then I walked away, leaving him to think about it. I suppose that's as honest as I can be. Now I sit here, alone in my apartment, with the hum of the refrigerator as my only companion. That memory of our wedding still dances across my mind occasionally. The flicker of candlelight, the organ's resonance, the brightness of her eyes. But I no longer cling to it. It's just a piece of who I was. The man who believed in forever is gone, and in his place stands someone else, someone quieter, colder, maybe stronger in a strange, hollow way. I can feel the final words forming in my mind, like the pull of a trigger. The pause before the bullet leaves the chamber. Perhaps that's the only true ending to this story. It doesn't matter who was right or wrong anymore. It doesn't matter if we both regret it. Time will keep marching, erasing the edges of our memories, turning passion into faint echoes. That's all I'm left with, emptiness where once there was everything. And I'm learning, day by day, that emptiness can be its own kind of freedom.